Today's lesson is topic writing, picture writing. Hi, I'm Mike.
And I'm Hanny.
So today we're going to be looking at a few pictures and then teaching you guys, or hopefully showing you guys, how to write a short essay, a short little composition on the pictures using the topic and using the things that you can learn from the picture.
好，我们这个月的主题是写作啊，就是要来练习看图写作。那在写这一类型的写作题目时，必须先仔细阅读这个写作要求，然后再参考图片，根据图片提供的讯息写一篇要符合题意而且论述顺畅的文章。那通常呢，题目就会要求我们针对图片里面的事件啊，或是讯息去表达看法或是省思。那我们今天题目会有2张图片是关于浪费食物，这个食物浪费 food waste 这个问题来论述。那我们现在就来练习吧。
Okay, so for our picture writing exercise, as you can see there, we have a couple of pictures. There's 2 pictures of a lot of food, but this is food that doesn't seem to have been eaten. We can probably assume that this food is going to be thrown away, and that brings us really to the central point of our picture writing or our topic for this month, and that is food waste. So as we can see on that first picture on the left there, it's after a big dinner party. A lot of people have enjoyed a lot of food, but they've also left a lot of food and drinks on the table. Now, assuming everyone's not going to be taking this home in a doggy bag, most of this is going to be ending up, well, pretty much where the picture on the right has it, in the garbage. We can see there someone is scraping food off their plate into a garbage can that is already overflowing with more wasted food. So I think if you've been paying attention to the news in the last few years, you might have heard articles about food waste and things like that. So that kind of answers our first question there. What problem comes to mind when you look at the pictures? I think food waste is the one that comes to mind very clearly, very strongly. And that leads us into question number 2. And this is kind of where we start to get a little creative. We start to get a little inspiration for our article or for our essay we'll write. What can we do to prevent this problem from happening in the future? Obviously, those pictures aren't providing any answers to that problem, so that's up to us. We have to kind of think about how to reduce food waste, how to better use food that we're not going to eat instead of just throwing it in the garbage, and also how to make better decisions before we cook the food while we're at the supermarket or something like that, about how to not buy too much food so it ends up in the garbage, because as we're going to learn, a lot of food does end up in the garbage all around the world every day, and it amounts to a huge amount of food waste.
好，那我们第一部分呢，就是要来练习依照这个提示进行写作。那我们就看到有2张图片啦，一张是满桌吃剩的美食，然后丢弃的食物，然后呢，第2张图片你就看到有人在把剩的食物把它丢掉。那我们从这2个图片要看到它所传达的讯息是什么。所以呢，我们在看到图片的时候，你就可以先思考看看。第一个问题就是说，当你看到这些图片的时候，你脑海中浮现什么问题呢？那很明显，我们就是有食物浪费的问题嘛。那么第2个问题是，你可以想想看，如果要避免未来再发生这样的问题，你可以怎么做呢？我们有哪些做法来避免食物浪费呢？所以这样看下来，我们文中就会分成2大段。第一段呢是要描述这2张图片传达的讯息，还有探讨它的影响。那么第2段呢，就是要说明你认为对这件事情可以采取什么样的具体行动，来避免加剧，来避免让这件事情变得更严重。
Okay, so let's get into it and start writing our first paragraph. So the first paragraph in our article begins, food waste is a huge global problem. Absolutely. It's a problem all around the world. That's why we use that great adjective, a global problem, meaning the globe, the world, in other words. So it's a problem around the world. In fact, close to 1/3 of all food produced for human consumption is wasted. It's good to kind of pause here a moment and just think about that. A third of all food. For the people who aren't quite familiar with that expression, a third, we're expressing kind of a fraction, a percentage in another way, just using this word. A third basically meaning 33%. A third of something is around 33%, 1 over 3, if you're expressing it as a fraction. So that's kind of crazy if you think about 1 kilogram out of every 3 kilograms of food that's bought or purchased or used in the world ends up in the garbage, ends up not being used or eaten by people. And if we're going to really dial down and do the hard math, we're going to come up with a very large number. And we get that number in the next sentence. That's around 1.3 billion tons of food every year. I mean, that is absolutely astonishing. I can't kind of picture how much 1.3 billion tons of food would be, but I would imagine a very large mountain of wasted food. So all of this stuff, it gets picked on farms, it gets shipped off to restaurants and supermarkets, but then it ends up going right back into the garbage. And what could we do with that food if we made better decisions, if we had better systems to not waste so much? It says if even a quarter of this food could be saved, it would be enough to feed 870 million hungry people. Now, of course, the problem is that a lot of food is wasted in the first world, and a lot of the people who are hungry are in the third world, and it's kind of hard to get this food off to them. But if we made better decisions in the whole food system, we could probably help out a lot of people and waste a lot less food.
好，那我们来看看第一段，我们说要去讲这2张图片它传达了什么讯息，去探讨它的影响。那现在我们开始写第一段呢，你就可以开门见山去指出这2张图片所反映出的问题。像我们课文范例，他就写说食物浪费是个巨大全球问题，就直接开门见山点出来，就是食物浪费这个全球问题。然后呢，接下来他用一些实际的数据来支持这是一个很大的问题，像刚刚 Mike 老师提到这个 a third of 什么什么，或者是 one quarter 什么什么，甚至有提到 1.3 billion tons of food， 他用一些实际的数据去告诉你说食物被浪费掉了多少。那如果把1/4浪费的食物省起来，可以养活8亿7千万饥饿的人口。那可是如果你在写作的时候，其实你当下可能考试或什么，你没有这些实际的数据可以马上来佐证的话，你也可以写看别的方式。你可以说，每当我们丢弃不要的食物的时候，就会促成食物浪费的问题。那令人震惊的是，全球生产食物呢，每年大约有一定比例被浪费掉。也许你大概知道有多少，你就可以写说大约1/3被浪费掉，或者是你可以说很多被浪费掉之类的。那我们现在要请 Mike 老师告诉我们说，那换你写看这边这个句子可以怎么说。
And that sentence reads, every time we discard unwanted food, we contribute to the global problem of food waste. Shockingly, around 1/3 of food produced around the world is thrown away each year. So there we go. We took a lot of those facts and we really focused it down into 2 very useful and informative sentences. All right, let's move on. It says, but food waste is not only a social problem, it's an environmental one too. Yeah, in that first section, we kind of talked about the social problem. We talked about some of the numbers, and here we're turning our attention less from feeding hungry people and how difficult that is to the difficulties created for the environment by a lot of this food waste. How does that happen? How does that work? Well, we learned growing, processing, packaging, and transporting food requires a lot of natural resources and generates significant emissions. So basically every stage of the food production process, from growing it on the farm, processing it, freezing it, boxing it in factories, packaging it, and then putting it on trucks and ships and getting it all around the world. And all of that requires a lot of natural resources using electricity and fuel for airplanes, trucks, boats, and it generates significant emissions. That's, of course, greenhouse gases. Indeed, nearly 10% of global greenhouse gas emissions come from food waste. This isn't just food production, this is food waste. So thinking of all those bananas that get shipped off to the store in a refrigerated truck but then end up brown and in the garbage, that adds up to a lot of waste. 10% of all the pollution we produce, or all the global greenhouse gas emissions. We're doing it, and then we're doing nothing with the food that we're spending all of those resources to process and package and get to the stores. Waste, waste, waste.
好，那我们刚刚先点出了食物浪费的问题之后，我们 们现在要指出说这个问题对社会和环境所造成的影响。像我们课文范例他写到说，食物浪费不仅仅是社会问题，也是一个环境问题。他就提到这种种植、加工、包装和运送食品的时候，你是需要大量的自然资源，然后产生了许多的排放，结果食物还被浪费掉，你花了这么多资源还被浪费掉。那他就有提到说，将近10%的这种全球温室气体排放量就是来自食物浪费。好，那现在我们要写的话呢，你也可以试着用条列式的方式去写，像你就可以说，食物浪费之所以会是这么严重的问题，原因有很多，你就说 there are many reasons why 怎么样怎么样，然后接下来你用 first, second, third 这样子去条列出来。好，假设我们现在要练习，你就写说，首先丢弃食物会对企业还有消费者产生很大的经济损失，这是一个原因。那么第二个呢，这个浪费的食物原本是可以拿来提供给这些营养不足啊、营养不良或是有财务困境的人嘛。还有你点出第三，这个浪费食物呢，也会意味着浪费了你这个从制造、存放、运送到整个过程，它这些所使用到的自然资源，就用条列式方式去列举出为什么是这么严重的问题。好，那这边补充一下，如果你要去表达营养不足、营养不良，你可以用 undernourished 这个字去形容，它就是营养不良的。好，那我们现在要请 Mike 老师帮我们念念看这个句子。
There are many reasons why food waste is such a serious issue. First, throwing away food incurs a large economic cost for both businesses and consumers. Second, food that is wasted could have fed those who are undernourished or financially struggling. Third, wasting food also means wasting the natural resources that went into producing, storing, and transporting that food. Great sentence there because it kind of lays out the problem in a very easy way to understand, looking at these three big issues that all deal with food waste, but in different ways. Moving on, we read, to put that figure in perspective, if food waste were a country, it would be the third highest emitter of greenhouse gases after the US and China. Clearly, something needs to be done. Okay, again, a lot of these numbers, as we've talked about, 1.3 billion tons of food is wasted. I mean, they're so big, it's kind of hard to understand. So that's why finding ways to sort of move it into a comparison that's a little easier for people to kind of get their heads around is a good idea. So that's why we talk about putting it in perspective, putting it in another framework that is hopefully easier to understand. So we're saying if food waste were a country, in other words, if the amount of energy and whatnot that's wasted on a food was converted or switched over and compared to another country in the world and how much pollution they produce, it would be number 3 after the US and China, the world's 2 biggest polluters. Clearly, something needs to be done. This is kind of a call for action, a call to focus our minds on coming up with solutions to this very serious problem.
好，那我们接下来就是要去具体说明这个问题的严重性。你刚刚听到可能几亿公吨啊，多少人什么的，那我们现在要把它具体化。像课文范例他就写到说，将数字客观来看，如果食物浪费是一个国家，那它将会是第3大温室气体排放国，就仅次于美国和中国。所以显然确实是要做点什么事，对不对？需要有所作为。那像如果我们自己在练习写的话，你也可以去写写看说，要了解食物浪费对环境所造成的负面影响有多么负面，影响多么大呢？你只要去想想看，你用来种植那些浪费食物所用到的土地，它其实一年所需要的土地是比中国还要大的哦。像这样也会带出一个很令人惊讶的事实。好，那现在我们要请 Mike 老师告诉我们这个换你写写看这个句子怎么说。
Let's look. It says, to understand how bad food waste is for the environment, just think of all the land that is used to grow food that never reaches our plates. It takes a landmass larger than China to produce all the food that we waste in a single year. Let's turn our attention to paragraph 2 now. Next we read, solving the problem of food waste would require a 3-pronged approach. At the consumer level, households could reduce waste by carefully planning their meals and creating better shopping lists. Okay, now it's moving on to the practical things, the actual steps and changes we can do and make in our lives. It's a 3-pronged approach. Prongs are sort of like the pointy parts of a fork. So if you think of a fork with 3 of those parts that you stick into your meat, sheet. We're using that to basically kind of say a three-step approach because there are three different areas in the home and, of course, industrially and supermarkets and restaurants, and then, of course, also on the farms. So that's what we're talking about. The first one is kind of at the home. These are the ones that we can do. That's why we call it the consumer level. You and I are consumers when we go to the supermarkets and buy food, and also when we order food in a restaurant, but mainly here about personal home shopping. Households could reduce waste by carefully planning their meals and making better shopping lists. In other words, making better decisions about what you're doing with your food.
好，那我们看到第二段呢，我们就要说明可以采取什么样的行动来改善问题。那现在就要开始举例说明应该采取的措施。像我们的课文范例，他提到说解决问题需要三管齐下，那他就从消费者的层面开始，这是第一个层面可以改善的部分。那像家庭就可以谨慎规划他们餐点，还有谨慎规划他们的这个购物清单，来减少浪费。那像我们要写的话，你也可以写说 To solve the problem, we need to 怎么样怎么样，然后也是条列式说 first, second 怎么样怎么样，这样也可以。那像我们就可以写说，首先呢，消费者必须更注意自己的消费，家家户户呢都应该增加采买次数，然后减少每次要买的品项。那这边补充一下哦，我们这边是要表达说，不要去采买大量容易腐烂的食物。这边我们可以用到 perishable 这个字 ，perish 它是有那种死亡毁灭的意思，在后面加上 able 就可以描述食物它是容易腐烂的，容易变质的。然后你还可以用 load up on something 去表达去采集大量的什么，去购买大量的什么。好，那我们接着要请 Mike 老师帮我们念这个换你写写看的句子。
To solve the problem of food waste, we need to make changes at three levels. First, consumers need to shop more mindfully. Instead of loading up on perishable goods with each supermarket trip, households should make more shopping trips and buy fewer items each time. Very good advice. Yeah, buy less, but buy more frequently. Now we'll move on to businesses. This is mainly supermarkets, restaurants, things like that. It says businesses could work with organizations to get surplus food to food banks and soup kitchens instead of throwing it out. I believe in France they have new laws for the last couple of years, and it basically says all restaurants and I think supermarkets have to give food that they're going to throw away but is still useful. They have to give it to food banks. So, laws like that would help too.
好，那这边呢，我们在讲到这个企业的层面呢，他们也许可以跟机构合作，把剩下的食物送到食物银行啊，或者是这个慈善厨房，而不是把它丢弃。那像我们在写的时候，我们也许可以提到说，有一些食物快过期，不是会把它降价吗？你就可以写说，除了积极的为这些快过期的食物降价，那其实这些零售业者呢，也可以把过剩的食物把它捐出去，用这样来表达。好，那我们就请 Mike 老师帮我们念这个句子。
In addition to aggressively marking down the prices of items as they near their expiration date, retail businesses could donate excess food to charity organizations. All right, and then what about the government? How can the government help us make good decisions or avoid wasting food? And governments, we read, could enact legislation to ensure edible food surpluses are offered to the hungry or used as feed for animals. Yeah, I think they do that here in Taiwan. And as I mentioned, there are countries that have laws that say food that will be wasted should actually go to food banks and places like that.
好，那接下来在政府的层面可以怎么做呢？那政府可以立法来确保提供这些可食用的剩余食物食粮给饥饿者，或者是用来做动物的饲料。好，那你想想看还有什么别的方法呢？也许是政府他们可以去资助赞助一些教育活动，像我们说那种卫教运动教育活动，我们用 educational campaigns 去表达这种活动，然后去提升大众意识，教导大家这个食物浪费跟他们的影响。好，那接着我们就请 Mike 老师告诉我们这边这个句子可以怎么说。
Finally, governments could sponsor educational campaigns to raise awareness about food waste and its impacts. Okay, and then we kind of finish with a bit of a call to arms, kind of motivate us to focus our minds and get out there to do this properly. If we all work together, it says we can guarantee that food gets to those who need it and that our precious natural resources aren't wasted. Wouldn't that be good for everyone and the planet as well?
好，那我们最后当然要写结论啊，就是说大家一起共同努力，把这些食物送到需要的人手上，那这样珍贵的资源才不会被浪费嘛。那我们在写的时候，你也可以写说，我们每个人都可以帮助减少食物浪费，还有呢，它对这个社会啊、经济还有环境方面的影响，所以我们应该要尽一己之力。Let's do our part， 就是我们来尽一己之力这样的意思。好，那我们来请 Mike 老师帮我们念这个最后结论的句子。
Everyone can help reduce food waste and its social, economic, and environmental impacts. So let's do our part. Okay, so let's look at some of these useful words that we might want to use in our essay and that we've seen in the example essay. Consumption, of course, is a very important one, not just for talking about food waste, but for anything with the environment. When you consume something, you're using something up, and this is, of course, the noun form of consumption. The consumption of food, the consumption of electricity, the consumption of gasoline and other natural resources, all of these things contribute to some of the environmental problems we're facing. And then we also had down at the bottom enact legislation. We didn't really talk about this too much in the article, and this is actually more about government doing the business of government. To enact something is to put it into use, right? So it's not something in the real world. You wouldn't enact a hairdryer to dry your hair, but we enact things like laws. We enact things like policies. We enact things like rules, things like that. So legislation, basically laws. Now, if you want to say this in a slightly simpler way, and a way you might read very frequently, we could just say if governments pass laws. To enact legislation is like to pass a law. You come up with a law, the government votes on it. If they all approve, it passes, and then you start to use that law, you enact that law.
好，那我们在课文第二段落这边呢，我们注意到他有提到 food bank 跟 soup kitchen。那这边补充一下food bank 食物银行呢，它一般是指说透过慈善团体啊，或者是其他组织来提供有需求者提供他们免费食物的那种食物银行。那如果是 soup kitchen 的话，你可能会看到，有人特别在那边装食物给别人吃嘛。那 soup kitchen 它就是指说为这种穷人或流浪者所设立的这种慈善厨房、流动厨房的意思。
All right, that's all the time we have for today. Thanks for listening to us. We'll see you back here next month with another interesting topic for some sample writing.